Good morning, everybody. I thought what I would do this morning is kind of explore the way that the self has been conceptualized really throughout history by focusing on a number of recurring themes, and through that trying to isolate what I think are some of the key questions that we need to think about and reflect on. When I wrote this lecture, I said, well, what have I been thinking about in relation to the self over my own intellectual development? Because I remember that when I was an undergraduate, a very long time ago, my final sort of thesis, that you do in your last year university, was on the self, particularly on the alienated self. And I still have notes on the self that go back almost 4 decades. And I thought I would kind of look at it before the lecture and see the way that my own concerns and my ideas have really kind of evolved, which I think was really quite useful because, just as you go back and forth in history, so often it's really nice to go back and forth in terms of your own intellectual development and to see, how these things interweave. And one of the things that really hit me when I looked at my notes and kind of looked at the literature on it, looked at the different philosophers and theologians, psychologists dealing with the question, is that actually the title of this talk, The Emergence of the Self in History, is incorrect. Because if anything, the title of this talk should be about the emerging self. Because the wonderful thing about the self is that it's always in the in the process of changing and mutating and developing new dimensions of itself. And in many respects, how we view the self, the things that we attribute to it, and above all, the way we experience ourselves, is always changing because, to some extent, whether we like it or not, we are always in the business of remaking ourselves. And that's one of the central dimensions of the human experience, that the self doesn't stay still. And in a sense, any project that sets out to discover the self invariably ends in failure, for the very simple reason that the self can never be discovered or cast into a fixed form as long as we continue to imagine. It's only when you stop imagining and reflecting on the world that the self can ever stay still. And in many respects, the attitudes that we have about the self are invariably related to the way we view the relationship between the self and society. And in a sense, throughout history, the discussion on the self has always been about what it is that impinges on the self. What is it that what are the forces, or spiritual or physical or material, that impinge upon the self? What are these external forces to it that force the self to conform to certain patterns of behavior? How does that work? Now, my own concern in this discussion, and also in my own work, is to establish the case for an idea of the self that combines a voluntarist dimension of self-formation with the recognition that self-determination has its limits and must always settle accounts with constant and unpredictable demands of external necessity. So you have to understand that on the one hand, the self has this voluntaristic, idealized form of existence where it continually strives to free itself of every encumbrance, but at the same time, even in the best case scenario, there is material, physical, social reality that you got to, in some shape or form, relate to. And what I'm really interested in is a kind of self-creation through self-conscious cultivation of the self, without falling into the idealistic and sometimes mystical solutions which attempt to transcend the self. You get this, for example, in mystical religions, in forms of Christianity, where the hermits go off into the desert and spend years and years looking into their soul, obviously leading to this quest for something that they can never really discover. I think we have some wonderful ideas about the self from different philosophical traditions, such as the Stoics, for example. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later on, or even Adam Smith's idea of self-command, which is based upon virtuous behavior. Myself, I think that the most important sort of contribution towards understanding the workings of the self is within Marx. I think Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach is absolutely critical for understanding how the self works. And if you recall, what Marx did was to provide us with a very useful concept of self-emancipation, an idea that he developed over a period of time. And really, what's important for me is that what Marx did was that for Marx, human activity, as he says in the third thesis on Feuerbach, means self-change. I think self-change is something that is central to his theory. And basically, as far as he was concerned, being human and self-change were actually synonymous. The two overlapped in a very fundamental way with each other. And he basically said that any activity which is not self-changing is not human. Right? Any activity which is not self-changing is not human. And for him, the term self-change implies the mutual transformation of an active subject which does the interpreting and changing, and an object which is interpreted and changed. And I think that kind of relationship is really beautifully set out in some of his earlier writing. But let's just take a step back and ask the question, well, what is the self? What is the self that we're discussing? So as I suggested, it's a fluid concept that changes with time. But whenever we think about the self, what we commonly mean is the particular being of a person, any person, whatever it is about each of us that distinguishes you or me from others, draws the parts of our existence together, persists through changes, or opens the way to becoming who we might be or should be. There's a future-oriented dimension to the self as well. And I think in what I certainly found to be the most interesting study, historical study of the self, particularly in political theory, there's a man called Gerald Seigel. He wrote a book called The Idea of the Self. Seigel claims that there are three important dimensions through which the self sort of has been approached in Western culture, especially since Descartes and Locke. It's really from Descartes and Locke onward that we have this more modernist view of it, where he argues that the three dimensions through which we can approach the self is, first of all, bodily or material, which relates to the physical material existence of individuals or nature, driven by needs, urges, inclinations, which influences our temperament. So that's, in many respects, a presupposition of the self. Secondly, there is the relational dimension of the self, which arises from social and cultural interaction, collective identities and shared orientations and values and language that marks out our particular form of expression. And in this perspective, ourselves are what our relations with society is, and the way that shapes or allows us to be. And thirdly, and for me very importantly, there's a third dimension, which is the reflective dimension of the self, the reflective dimension of the self, the act of making ourselves the object of our active regard, examining and judging our own being, not just to understand ourselves, but to revise it. I think that's a very important element of this kind of reflective element. And I think this third dimension of the self is particularly important for those of us who are concerned to understand the self's relation to freedom and autonomy, or to cultivate a sense of autonomy. I think that the relation here is critically important. Now, depending on where people stand on this question of autonomy, will determine how they assess reflection. They will either seek to exalt the power of reflection, or alternatively to diminish it and seeing it as not being sort of particularly important. Now, of course, reflection is not the only power that can be mobilized against the limits of individual and social existence. There is other ways of overcoming social constraints, but my view is, what I feel very strongly about, is that whatever the strengths and weaknesses of such strategy, of any strategy, they still require a prior act of subjectivity. Whatever strategy one adopts in order to go beyond, there's a logically prior point at which the act of subjectivity becomes really critical. Because really, at the end of the day, it's only in thought that we can take the distance, or begin to take a distance, ideally, from every form of determinant existence. It alone provokes a medium for self-determination and freedom. So the first stage for the cultivation of freedom has got to be in the mind. It cannot exist in a way that is external to it. And obviously the mind itself is very much influenced by sort of social developments and social influences. Now an act of subjectivity involves an element of imagination. Self-determination, before having to test the boundary of necessity, has this kind of imaginative quality to it. And even a limited but substantial independence from the material and relational conditions that partly determine it. So I think in this sense we can see reflectivity as a power, as a medium through which we can create a space for the exercise of autonomy. And that's really what it's all about. It's almost like an attempt to create a space within which we can determine for ourselves certain dimensions of our lives. Now, reflection can exist in a passive or an active form. There are different ways of understanding it. So the question about reflection is it intentional? Is it willed? Because it's got to be that if it's going to acquire a conscious and purposeful form. And it seems to me that the logical priority of self-directed and willed reflection is critical, but it does not mean that we can ignore the social and the relational dimensions. Have to remember that when you and I talk about discovering our true selves, or we talk about reflecting on ourselves, on our real selves, the very attempt to grasp ourselves is influenced not simply by our own imagination, but preconceived and culturally framed ideas about the self and how the self needs to be understood. And I think that's the balance we need to put on this very important relationship. That there are limits to the freedom of the reflective self was already intuitively grasped by the Greeks. And they understood that what is gained in inner freedom is not always harmonious with the workings of actual life. I mean, that's what Greek tragedies were really all about. On the one hand, an attempt to gain that kind of inner freedom, but you do pay a serious price very often for that project. Just very briefly, this is really for the whole couple of days, there are certain questions that are always raised about the self. One of the questions that is raised and re-raised throughout history is whether the self is innate or the product of external experience. Locke, for example, claimed that it was not innate, and it caused a lot of trouble for him, particularly by religious people who regarded the soul and the self as some innate gift from God right from the beginning. So philosophers like Butler very much objected to that. On the other extreme, you have someone like Durkheim, whose writings on the self are really fantastic, who's basically regarded the self as fundamentally social and regarded the sense of self as principally a social accomplishment. Very important, this question, because it's linked to another question, which is that, is the self noble through introspection, reflection, or through others in society who act as a mirror for us through which we see ourselves? Another question that's raised, particularly in modern times, particularly by Scottish moral philosophers and their mates, which is the self selfish, or is it oriented towards solidarity? With Hume, sympathy coexists with self-love. It fuses together the idea that we have of someone else's feeling with our own. The self provides a vehicle for social interactions. Another question, is the self rational or not? In the 19th century, you had the beginnings of development of irrationality, where you had someone like Schelling coming along and to a limited extent even Fichte, arguing against Kant in this respect. It's at this point that you have the first serious questions being raised about autonomy. Sort of what does autonomy mean at this particular stage in time? But I think that whatever the questions are, whatever they're posed, the one thing that we have to remember that if you want to know what the self, yourself, is really like, if there is such a thing as a self, we find that it is something that is true whenever we have a conversation with ourselves. I think we forget the fact that all of us, as human beings, are continually having a conversation with ourselves, whether we know it or not. And once you stop having that conversation, and you do begin to have some very serious kind of mental health problems of various sorts. Lots of debates about which comes first, whether the self comes first or its empirical reality. In other words, is the self already in existence before it's actually willed or acted upon? I think there are two interesting questions that come out of these other bigger questions, or two important trends that are in competition with each other and which dominate our existence even today. I think that on the one side we have a belief by some people about the importance of authorizing the self. The authority of the self is seen as being really important, and anybody that takes self-determination and self-fashioning seriously will see the authorization of the self as really quite important. The authority of the self was seen as almost absolute by Hegel, who argued that through grasping the self, we can actually understand the meaning of the age, the spirit of the age. And he had a very sort of overwhelmingly positive attitude towards this. In Marx, we have the theory of self-creation, which leads to self-emancipation. But on the other hand, what we have, and I think this is becoming increasingly important in the in the 20th century and increasingly today, is the de-authorization of the self, where basically, as against the self, particularly the self-determining self, we have an emphasis on the power of the unconscious. We have an emphasis on the fragility of the self. We talk about the multiple selves, and the more multiple is the self, the less fixed the self can ever become. And as a result of that, we have a much more diminished version of the self in the 21st century very often than would have been the case in the Enlightenment or even in the immediate post-Enlightenment era. I always go back to the Greeks because in many respects it's in the Greek era, that the shift begins to occur where the self is really taken seriously. And to some extent, the Greeks discovered the self. And it took them a very long time to discover the self. If you read, for example, Homer's tragedies or legends, because it wasn't a tragedy, it was a legend or whatever it was, a poem, the people in the Odyssey, for example, all these big heroes very seldom reflect on themselves. They have no interior life. And in fact, when you look at the way that Homer writes about people, these heroes, he talks about their physicality and their bodily dimensions rather than anything to do with their interiority. It's interesting that there is no introspection within Homer at all. But no sooner has Homer written these legends than bit by bit the idea that somehow all the decisions and thoughts coming from God, which was the traditional idea, is gradually begin to called into question. And bit by bit, you have the emergence of self-processes being intuited and taken seriously in Greek culture. And I think that what you have amongst the Greeks is a rise of thinking, a revolution, in fact, where all of a sudden they do begin to discover the human mind and the human self. And if you look, for example, at Freud, it's not for nothing that Freud interprets the Oedipus tragedy in a psychological way. But really what he's looking at are these universal unconscious problems, very modern problems, which are already immanent within the Greek tragedies themselves. Because what you've got there, and this really comes out in the Oedipus tragedy, is this discovery of human freedom where Oedipus, sort of, in a sense, takes away, does things that completely go against tradition, against what the gods expect him to do. And in the very act of challenging the gods, Oedipus, in a sense, seizes self-capacity and moral freedom from the gods. He kind of diminishes the power and influence of the gods in so doing. And in a sense, he kind of steals something really important from the gods. And a capacity that has been attributed to socially higher, quasi-religious system is then brought down to earth, in a psychological sense, into the self. And by the time we get to Plato and we have Socrates' Dialogue, then what you have is a much clearer understanding of self-reflection being promoted. And so too with the Stoics, very exciting ideas being developed about the importance of the self, of changing yourself, and being able to control your life, through that whole process. So I think that with the Greeks, what you've got is this very interesting development where the self is discovered, where the soul, which is discussed by both Plato and Aristotle, becomes the center of selfhood, and in a sense becomes the principle of life and thought. When you get to the Christian Middle Ages, you have the Christian doctrine of the soul, its sacredness, immortality, a kind of freedom bolstered self. When you look at Augustine, for example, he looks at the vast interiority of the human being that could be explored with these kind of new ideas. However, what Christianity does, in a sense, is it also takes a lot away from the self. Certainly it takes a lot away from the self, the sense of self that the Greeks developed, because the soul and the interaction of the soul is with God, and it's by divine grace made from an external authority that is both porous and non-rational, that in a sense the soul gains its kind of character. So what you've got in a sense in Christian Europe is that both freedom and cognition loses some of its autonomy that has been achieved in the classical Greek self because of the interaction with God. Nevertheless, I think the Middle Ages are very complex, and you have a situation where the idea of the immortal soul increases the importance of the self in many, many ways, which would have long-term consequences for European civilization and European ideas. But at the same time, the idea of God submerged the self under a higher regime of knowledge. I think that's the ambiguous relationship that we have from the Christian tradition as developed in the Middle Ages, until Luther comes along. And I think Luther is, as you know, I circulated the article because I wasn't going to talk a lot about Luther. I think what's really important about Luther is that he didn't simply claim the authority of individual conscience on his behalf, but he basically put forward an argument that more or less negated the capacity of external authority to exercise power over the inner life of people. And I think that was a very important step forward, because in refusing to allow external authority to have any power over people's inner life, he more or less created the foundation for authorizing the self. And in the very act of endowing the self with authority, he fundamentally undermined all forms of external authority. And as Marx himself said, after Luther, the meaning of authority is perpetually called into question. And in a sense, what we have is a crisis that emerges out of Luther, where the aspiration of authority, of autonomy, that's not influenced by external authority, gains growing momentum. So that really from the Reformation onwards, all the way through the 18th, 19th, 20th century, this aspiration to authorize the self and limit external influences, because one of the common themes within Western political theory and within Western philosophy and social thought. And in that sense, I think that what we have is a very important sort of transformation occurring. I think this contradictory relationship that Luther kind of brings about is never resolved. It creates a powerful anti-authoritarian tendency, which is a positive development, the refusal to take authority on face value, that authority has now got to be earned. And I think there's an important liberating impulse. I mean, Luther himself was by no means a liberal. He was a very unpleasant person in many respects in terms of the kind of policies that he put forward. But it often shows you that somehow, and very often, when you take ideas up to a certain point, they do raise certain contradictory elements which evolve and develop in directions that you never sort of suspected. So this fundamental blow to authority then leads to the sort of authoritization of the self. And I think that here we come to the present moment. By present moment, I mean recent 40, 50, 60 years, where a new kind of contradiction emerges, which is still with us all the time, which kind of haunts many aspects of the world that we live in. Because one of the things that occurs is the very moment that the authority of the self gains cultural power and valuation, it inevitably becomes decentered. I mean, the more we have a sense of ourself, and the self, our self-focus gains momentum, at that particular moment, it almost becomes so fluid and so difficult to kind of imagine that it becomes decentered. And in the act of becoming decentered, it becomes aware of its own fragility in a world that is increasingly unpredictable. And in many respects, what I've been arguing recently is that the perception and the consciousness of the fragile self, which is explained as being the result of an unpredictable world, a fast-changing world, is more complicated because our perception of a fast-changing, unpredictable world that we cannot really direct, where our fate becomes subject to so many heterogeneous, complex influences, where complexity becomes this famous word that is used to explain anything that we don't understand. Complexity, it breeds more complexity. I would argue is an indirect product of our own fragile self, so that the perceptions that we have of our own inner life, of our own inner world, is to some extent sublimated through an external reality of complex fragility that we simply cannot possibly master. And I think it's important to understand that it is this sort of this kind of idea of who we are that, in a sense, is the most important determinant in the way that this external reality is perceived and understood. And that's why I think, because of this, we have all these developments, very unfortunate developments, but understandable. I don't think we can just dismiss it and simply criticize it, where as a result of that, in the contemporary era, the self continually demands protection for itself against external forces that threaten to overwhelm it. And the self, certainly in the Anglo-American context, in the act of demanding to be protected from these difficult forces, actually begins to revel in its own weakness and fragility. And it's almost like the fragile, decentered, multiple self, which is saturated in powerlessness and in weakness, becomes a trope, a cultural trope that we kind of celebrate, to the point at which so many films and so many novels in popular culture present this kind of self, this sensitive self, And by what they mean by sensitivity is that it's extremely sensitive to its own weakness and its own self-imposed, almost imprisoned way of perceiving itself. And under these circumstances, it's more or less inevitable that the self's weakness and fragility and its demand to be protected from external forces will become politicized. It's more or less inevitable that under those circumstances, the self will find very, very, very difficult to find politics outside of the self. And instead you have the demand, which was coined in the 70s, the personal is political, which ultimately becomes the self itself becomes political as well. And I think it's in this context that in the very act of attempting to kind of politicize itself, you end up embarking on a path that invariably leads to the dead end of identity politics. See, the problem is not identity, because we all need identity, and the problem isn't the fact that we aspire to cultivate our identity, because, as Marx himself said, we have to change ourselves to be genuinely human. I think that the problem is when the identity, the politicized self, acquires this kind of almost like a self-propelled dimension, where it basically, pleads for protection, pleads that its weakness should be recognized. And I think under those circumstances, what you have is a complete reversal of the trajectory of self-determination, which is something that we become aware of in early modernity, a complete reversal of it. But the self, in this sense of fragility, is in practice more than happy to trade in its claim to autonomy for the provision of respect and esteem. So what we end up with is that in the very authorization of the self, in the conditions of the last 40 or 50 years, the very authorization of the self leads to its ultimate deauthorization. Because the very moment you allow external forces to guide you, and you allow external forces to provide the bridge for your own way forward in life, what you're saying, in effect, is that your autonomy, your capacity for self-determination, becomes a commodity that you're willing to exchange for the protection that you provided. And the whole argument that I put forward elsewhere about the freedom-security trade-off is actually based on this psychological dynamic that is being created at that particular time. So that's why we have a world where what counts is not self-determination or autonomy, but what counts is giving people respect and esteeming them. That is what becomes desirable, or in political theory, what we end up with is almost like the politics of recognition as the way forward, as the ultimately civilized way of respecting one another in the 21st century, something that I think in many respects is the main enemy out there that we need to argue and debate about because of its dehumanizing consequences. Right, thanks.